That feeling like you're just constantly on, maybe a little fried, or you look at the world around you and think, wow, is this it? Is this working for anyone?
Yeah.
What if humanity right now, collectively, is acting less like a brilliant species thriving and more like, well, like a cell that's just gotten sick. Not evil, just
Yeah.
misfiring.
It's it's quite an image, isn't it? The idea that we might be behaving as a misfiring, self-damaging cell
Yeah.
within this, larger body of Earth or maybe civilization itself. And that challenging idea is exactly where the source material for this deep dive really kicks off. It's not meant as a condemnation, more like a diagnosis from a real particular perspective.
Yeah, that phrase, misfiring, self-damaging cell, it comes from these excerpts we've been digging into from a really thought-provoking piece of writing. The title alone is intense, maybe even a bit confrontational. Anthrocytic Disease and the Violent Universe, How Consciousness Evolves Through Fire.
Right? It signals straight away this isn't going to be like a gentle read. It really asks us to look at everything, the world, our systems, ourselves, through this very specific, maybe uncomfortable lens. And the source gives this unusual instruction right at the start. It suggests you read it, not to just believe it, but more like engage with it like a simulator.
A simulator for seeing and feeling, that's interesting. Like it's trying to actively repattern your perception, change how you sense reality, not just dump information in your head. And honestly, given how dense and frankly radical some of these ideas are, approaching it that way feels kind of necessary.
Yeah, definitely. So our mission today really is to unpack this stuff, to try and pull out the most potent insights, the nuggets of knowledge that might genuinely shift how you see things. We're going to wrestle with concepts like, what is this anthrocytic disease it talks about? Explore that challenging idea of a violent universe.
And we'll tackle this meta framework called Ontosinclecticism, which sounds super complex, but actually gets quite practical when you break it down, and really get to the heart of the source's central, maybe kind of counterintuitive point, that consciousness doesn't just like survive difficulty or fire, it actually evolves through it. It metabolizes the intensity.
Exactly. And why should you care about this deep dive? Well, if you've ever felt that, that pervasive stress, the burnout,
Yeah.
if you look at the world's systems, political, economic, environmental, and just felt this deep sense that things are fundamentally off, misaligned. If you've wondered why we as a species seem stuck repeating these patterns that clearly don't serve us, this material offers a really powerful alternative way to understand it.
It's about maybe getting some tools, right? Tools to help you see the underlying patterns, maybe build differently in your own life, maybe even interrupt that cycle of passing down these old, kind of outdated ways of operating. It's a deep dive into the very architecture of our shared reality, both inside and out.
So, okay, let's step into the simulator, as it were.
All right, so let's start with the foundation. The source doesn't begin with us, with humans. It starts bigger with the universe itself. And it describes it in a way that might surprise some people as a violent universe.
Yeah, right out of the gate, it kind of pushes against our usual picture of, a calm, maybe empty cosmos. The source talks about the universe not as this peaceful void, but as a substrate of pattern turbulence. You can sort of picture it like this constantly churning, expanding, dynamic field of energy and process.
Pattern turbulence. Okay, that's interesting. So chaos, but with some underlying structure.
Exactly that. And this turbulence, it argues, isn't just background static. It's the actual engine of reality. The universe expands through rupture, think the Big Bang, supernovas exploding. It evolves through combustion, the nuclear fusion happening inside stars, the intense pressures that literally forge elements. Every atom in your body, the source points out, the calcium, the carbon, it was all forged in the collapse of ancient stars, right in the heart of these immense, violent processes.
Wow. So we didn't just gently float into existence. We arrived smack bang in the middle of this dynamic, turbulent, fiery field.
That's the picture.
Here.
And here's the really crucial bit. The source argues that consciousness, our human awareness included, is not some detached thing watching from the sidelines. It wasn't born outside the fire to calmly analyze it.
It says consciousness is born through it and forged in thresholds. So it learns by hitting friction, by failing, by breaking its own boundaries.
Yeah, precisely. It doesn't try to escape the fire. It learns to metabolize it, like to take that intense energy and transform it into something else. Growth, understanding, resilience, kind of like how a biological system processes input.
That's a really different way of looking at awareness. It suggests our ability to grow is actually tied to facing intensity, not running from it. So if we were born in this universal fire, into this field of pressure, then our earliest history, hundreds of thousands of years ago, that must have been defined by this inherent violence, too.
And that leads us straight into what the source calls the logic of survival. What did those initial, really harsh conditions wire into us as a species?
Right, the conditions were, well, brutal, weren't they? Constant threats.
Unbelievably so. Predation from bigger animals, the constant gnawing risk of starvation or drought, harsh, unpredictable climates, violence from other human groups fighting for the same scarce resources, plus just this deep biological fear response hardwired into our nervous systems as a basic alarm.
And on top of all that, you've got this idea of emotional inheritance, right? The accumulated stress and trauma passed down generation after generation.
Yeah, it wasn't just mild discomfort. These were existential pressures day in, day out. And they shaped us profoundly. The source argues that traits we might see as negative now, things like aggression, intense tribalism, dominance hierarchies, fierce competition, hoarding resources, deep fear of the other, this relentless drive to control uncertainty, they weren't seen as like moral failings back then. They were essential. They were successful survival tools in an environment where failure literally meant death.
We were wired that way because we had to be. The source is really clear. This isn't about blaming our ancestors. It's about recognizing the deep historical programming we carry.
And this intense evolutionary pressure, it forged this fundamental link in our psyche between sheer survival and accumulation. Having more food, more water, more tools, eventually more land or allies, wasn't initially about status or greed. It was literally the difference between making it through a famine or a drought or not. Accumulation was the necessary shield against a terrifying, unpredictable unknown.
So that impulse, that deep urge to gather, to hold on to stuff, it's wired into our oldest system, right? Directly tied to the basic need for safety. And the source points to a core feedback loop that kind of solidified from all this, a loop that didn't just run individuals, but became, like you said, the engine that built the world as we know it.
Yeah, the survival loop, it goes. Pain, fear, control, conflict, pain. So something bad happens, a loss, uncertainty, a rupture, that's the pain. This immediately triggers fear in our ancient nervous system. Fear then demands a response, usually a drive for control, trying to manage the environment, manage other people, manage our internal state to feel safe again. But seeking control, especially over complex, unpredictable things or other people, almost inevitably leads to conflict. And conflict, of course, creates more pain.
And round it goes. And the source argues this loop didn't just flicker on and off. It embedded itself deep down, right in the roots of civilization itself. It replicates through generations. It shapes governments, economies, institutions, even our tiny little daily gestures and reactions. It's the core pattern that prioritized just keeping things going, continuity over asking if it actually makes sense, coherence, and prioritized dominance, controlling everything over really understanding things in depth.
And the source really emphasizes this point, maybe the most critical one, just seeing this loop, recognizing its ancient roots and how it still runs constantly in our modern lives and our systems. That's presented as the absolutely vital first step. The first step towards maybe healing it, or at least finding a way to interrupt its relentless cycle.
Yeah, you can't fix something if you don't even see the code it's running on, right? Which takes us right to that central diagnostic term, the source coins.
The Anthrocytic Disease.
That term really jumps out. What exactly is it trying to name?
Let's break it down like the source does. It's got two parts. Anthro, meaning human, and chelicitic, which relates to a cell, like a basic biological unit of function.
So literally something like human cellular disease or human unit disease. Okay.
Exactly. And what it's naming is this phenomenon where humanity as a collective starts behaving like a misfiring, self-damaging cell within a larger organism.
Yeah.
Now, that organism could be seen as Earth itself, or maybe civilization as a whole, or even, as the source sometimes hints, the larger sort of simulation of reality we inhabit.
Okay, hang on. That sounds pretty harsh, like it's calling humanity a disease.
This is where the source is super careful, and it's really crucial we get this nuance across. The source explicitly states multiple times this term is not meant as a condemnation. It is not saying humanity is inherently evil or fundamentally bad or like a virus that needs wiping out. Not at all.
It's a diagnosis of a behavior pattern, not a moral judgment on our species.
Precisely. It's trying to understand why we behave this way, tracing it all the way back to that evolutionary wiring we just talked about, shaped under immense survival pressure. There's a line in the source that captures it perfectly. What appears today as toxicity is often a survival strategy left running too long.
Wow. Yeah, that really clicks. It reframes so much of what feels wrong or broken in the world. Our relentless consumption, Maybe our difficulty connecting deeply, our fear of vulnerability. It's not necessarily inherent badness, but more like emergency programming that got stuck in the on position.
Yes. And it's framed not as like a terminal illness, but potentially as the fever before awakening, a sign that the old survival code, which worked brilliantly in a scarcity environment for millennia, is now actively malfunctioning in our complex, interconnected world, precisely because a new level of consciousness, a new way of relating to reality, is trying to emerge through us. We are, in this view, an intelligent system running on outdated software, and that fundamental misalignment is the disease state.
And you can see the symptoms of this disease, this misalignment playing out everywhere, right, on multiple levels.
Absolutely. The source gives some vivid examples. Look at our relationship with ecology. We strip forests bare, pollute rivers, poison the soil we depend on for food. It's the behavior of a cell damaging the very body it lives within, almost as if it's forgotten, that fundamental connection, that dependency.
Or even inside ourselves in our psychology. This relentless push for speed, status, constant productivity, often at the cost of essential human things like rest, empathy, just simple inner silence. We treat ourselves like machines that need optimizing for external output, totally ignoring the delicate internal ecosystem.
And in economics, you see the same pattern echo, treating human energy as just an extractable resource called labor. Quantifying productivity is the only real measure of value, even turning our attention spans into a commodity to be bought and sold. It all reflects this core pattern of a part humanity acting as if it's somehow separate from or even at war with the larger body it belongs to.
And the source argues this isn't driven by, conscious malice, but more by a breakdown in information flow. Like, the system isn't listening to itself.
Exactly. The information environment has collapsed, as the source puts it. The signals aren't getting through or they're being ignored. The system Humanity forgets how to listen to the feedback from the larger organism, from the planet, from his own collective body. It's a deep systemic communication breakdown between the individual or collective part and the whole system it's part of.
And this leads to what the source calls fragmentation. We've become incredibly good at abstraction, creating these complex systems of money, nations, ideologies, digital identities. But in doing that, we often lose touch with our fundamental nature as embodied animals who depend on physical systems for survival. The Anthrocytic disease, seen this way, is abstraction without integration. We get lost in our own sophisticated map and completely forget the actual territory. And our institutions, the things we created to, help organize society, they can actually end up perpetuating this dysfunction. The source uses this really powerful metaphor of institutions starting out as antibodies.
Yeah, antibodies that emerged maybe organically to help stabilize human behavior as groups got bigger and more complex. But, the source argues, when the underlying survival logics within those institutions, the rules, the incentives, the power structures become too rigid, when they stop taking in or acting on feedback from the changing world or from the suffering they might be causing, they can become autoimmune. They start attacking the very organism, the very society they were originally designed to protect. Think of bureaucracies that become ends in themselves, or legal systems that protect corporate entities more than living communities, or maybe even educational systems that stifle creativity in favor of standardization.
So it's not necessarily intentional evil from the people inside the system, but a profound misalignment of the system's core programming, its outdated operating principles. And this misalignment scales up, creating cultures and entire generations who feel chronically exhausted, disoriented, or numb because, as the source puts it, their very biology is rejecting the simulation. It's like our bodies are built for a different, more integrated frequency than the one the dominant system is broadcasting.
And anchoring all of this systemic dysfunction right down in our individual and collective bodies is the pervasive, often unseen impact of trauma. The source describes trauma not just as a personal psychological wound, but as a system-wide data corruption event happening within human beings as biological information processors.
Like a virus dropped into the core code, it interrupts our natural coherence, it scrambles emotional signals, making it hard to accurately read ourselves, others, or situations. It distorts our sense of time, and it fundamentally rewires our survival priorities. It essentially teaches the nervous system to mistrust safety, keeping us perpetually on guard, hypervigilant.
Trauma functions like a virus within the cell, embedding these false scripts, these distorted perceptions, and these compulsive behavioral loops that just perpetuate the dysfunction. And crucially, this isn't just individual. It becomes generational code, passed down silently through parenting styles, cultural norms, social structures, the design of institutions. This is why a culture steeped in unhealed trauma struggles so much.
It struggles to handle complexity, right?
I
It defaults to simplistic answers, seeks control rather than understanding, demands obedience over nuance, reacts instantly instead of reflecting. Its collective alarm system is just constantly firing, leading it to confuse difference or discomfort with existential threat.
In healing, within this framework, isn't about erasing the past or just getting over it. It's presented as radical data recovery. It's about restoring the system's capacity, both individually and collectively, to process reality without the distorting lens of past trauma, to learn how to distinguish signal from noise, what's actually happening now versus the echo of the past, and truth from trigger. It's about cleaning up that corrupted code that keeps us trapped in the survival loop.
So, okay, the Anthrocytic disease isn't just some catchy, dramatic label. It's a really detailed diagnosis, pointing to what happens when our ancient survival programming, forged in a violent world, runs unchecked in our complex modern one, amplified by layers of inherited trauma, and then gets perpetuated by the very systems we built based on that outdated code.
Exactly. And to really grasp the depth of this, the source says we need to look back, way back, at the historical roots of this pattern, this machine.
It argues that to understand the economic systems driving so much pressure today, we can't just look at, say, the last few hundred years of capitalism. We need to examine the logic of the very first civilizations.
Yeah, it traces the origins of what it calls the machine of growth, right back to the earliest empires. And it makes this really provocative claim that someone like Milton Friedman, with his doctrine that a corporation's only responsibility is profit, that wasn't some brilliant new invention.
It was more like a distillation, a polished, maybe highly rationalized version of an ancient code that's been running since, like, Mesopotamia.
That's the argument.
Hmm.
The source points out that in Mesopotamia, key innovations we take for granted, like writing in calendars, weren't initially developed for poetry or tracking religious festivals. They were primarily tools for control and resource management. Counting grain stores for the elite, measuring debt owed, timing tax collection cycles, planning huge irrigation projects that solidified central power. Abstraction, which maybe started as a useful way to manage the complexity of large-scale farming, very quickly became a powerful tool for domination and extraction.
Wow. So the basic idea that human life and energy exists mainly to generate value for some larger system, whether that system is a temple, a state, or eventually a corporation that didn't start in modern boardrooms. It started in ancient granaries, tax offices, and war rooms. Early civilizations, in this view, were structured a lot like primitive corporations. Rigid hierarchies, careful ledgers tracking everything, and the systematic extraction of surplus value from the population and the land.
And Friedman, from this perspective, just provided the ultimate, highly effective public relations campaign for this ancient impulse towards extraction and control. He masked the raw, often fear-driven drive with the clean language of rationality and free markets, stripping away the messy moral context, embedding growth measured purely by profit and accumulation as the ultimate, unquestioned virtue. And he made that incredibly dangerous assumption that the market itself would magically sort out all the ethical consequences down the line.
Which leads us right to what the source calls the Anthrocytic moment, when this ancient logic, now supercharged by modern technology and global scale, stops serving life and starts actively extracting from the very biological and social systems it depends on for its own existence, like that self-damaging cell attacking its host. And this purely economic logic didn't just stay confined to finance, did it? It leaked out everywhere.
Oh, completely. It permeated education, shifting the focus towards producing compliant workers for the machine. It influenced healthcare, tending towards treating bodies like machines needing fixing rather than whole systems needing care. It seeped into relationships, fostering more transactional thinking. And it fundamentally altered how we even define ourselves. Our sense of identity got tangled up with our perceived value within this machine of growth. The question, who am I, got subtly twisted into how much value can I generate? How productive am I? Life itself became a kind of performance economy, and growth was the faceless god measured only by a number that always demanded more.
And this external machine of growth, it's fueled and sustained by something internal, right? This programming the source calls our emotional inheritance.
Yeah, the idea that we inherit not just our genes, but also the deep survival logic, the emotional patterns of the systems and traumas our ancestors lived through, that deep, often totally unconscious feeling that whispers, if I do not control the future, I will not survive. It's usually not something we think consciously, but it runs like this background hum of anxiety in our nervous systems.
And that shows up as what? chronic anxiety, maybe? That panic when plans go slightly off track? The inability to truly rest? That relentless urge to overwork, overschedule, overplan everything?
All of that. We're unconsciously reacting to ancient encoded emergencies that are still running in our biology, even if the original threats are long gone. Scarcity wasn't just a temporary condition anymore. It became embedded as a personality trait. Control became a virtue. Uncertainty became an intolerable threat that had to be managed away.
And frustratingly, modern economics often took this distortion and formalized it into models based on the idea of purely rational actors just maximizing their self-interest. But the source argues this model isn't really a picture of objective human behavior.
It's more like a reflection of this emotional distortion, this deep, often unexamined belief that safety, worth, and even belonging must be constantly earned through relentless, quantifiable performance within the system.
And you see this playing out everywhere, don't you? The guilt we feel when we try to rest, the compulsive need for more, even when we have enough. The pressure to monetize every creative impulse, every hobby. We're unconsciously just reenacting this old ingrained ritual. Prove you are useful, prove you are productive, scalable, measurable, otherwise you face the terrifying prospect of what? Invisibility, lack, exile.
What started as an adaptive trauma response in truly harsh conditions, be vigilant, hoard resources, control what you can, became a cultural standard, amplified and embedded by the machine of growth. Schools reward compliance over creativity. Cities reward speed over presence. Some cultural narratives even seem to sanctify suffering as noble, and economies reward the relentless pursuit of more over activities that are reflective, regenerative, or simply about connection.
Because underneath all that sophisticated civilizational structure, all that economic theory, we're still operating with what the source calls the jungle inside us.
Yeah, this is a core idea. It's the recognition that beneath the relatively thin layer of civilization and rationality are most ancient nervous systems. The mammalian, the reptilian layers evolved over hundreds of thousands, millions of years, specifically to survive raw violence, to detect danger instantly, and to react reflexively. They were built for fight, flight, or freeze, not for philosophical debate or nuanced negotiation.
That immediate fight-or-flight response wasn't designed for navigating a difficult email thread or a tense board meeting or a disagreement with your partner. It was designed for escaping actual predators, for finding scarce food, for surviving brutal conflicts with other groups. It triggers immediate aggression or withdrawal or submission. And even though those specific prehistoric threats are mostly gone, that core circuitry is still very much active. It interprets modern stressors through that ancient, often inappropriate lens.
So a sharp tone in an email can feel like a predator's attack to the nervous system. Silence from someone we care about can trigger the ancient shame of potential exile from the tribe. A minor criticism at work can ignite a disproportionate fury. The body remembers its evolutionary trauma, the source argues, and it responds to modern social or economic conflict with deeply ingrained prehistoric logic.
So the source isn't saying humans are fundamentally bad or evil, but that in these deeper layers we are, in a sense, unevolved relative to the complexity of the world we've created. We are still governed by these ancient impulses meant for a very different time, caught in these deeply embedded loops where survival responses automatically override more nuanced capacities like empathy, long-term foresight, or collaborative problem solving. It's a diagnosis based on inherited reflexes, on ancient patterns still running the show.
And understanding this directly challenges a cornerstone of Western thinking, the myth of the rational self.
Right, that whole tradition, going back to Plato and Aristotle, really cemented in the Enlightenment, that defines humans primarily by our capacity for reason. The idea that logic governs our behavior and consciousness is firmly in the driver's seat. Milton Friedman's economic model is a direct descendant, assuming individuals make purely rational choices based on calculated self-interest.
But the source slams that against decades of modern neuroscience and trauma research. Think about the work of people like Antonio Damasio, which shows pretty convincingly that emotion isn't some separate thing that interferes with reason. It's actually foundational to reason. People who have damage to the emotional centers of their brain struggle profoundly with decision-making, even simple logical ones. Logic alone doesn't actually motivate action. Emotion is what assigns value, assigns priority, tells us what matters enough to act on.
So we don't coolly analyze all the facts and then make a rational decision. It's more like, We feel first, often unconsciously, deep in our bodies and older brain structures, and then our conscious, rational mind quickly spins a story to justify the decision that's already been made or is already in motion. This totally reframes that anthrocytic behavior we talked about. It's not irrational because humans are somehow flawed or stupid. It's irrational relative to modern conditions because our core cognition was shaped in a survival crucible, not a philosophy seminar room.
And anyone involved in, say, marketing or politics or even religious leadership, they implicitly understand this deep truth. What stirs the animal drives the human. That's why purely informational approaches, educational models based solely on providing more data as the cure for societal problems, often fall flat. The underlying dysfunction isn't usually a lack of information. It's this profound misalignment between our ancient emotional and biological wiring and the relentless abstract demands of modern conditions.
Yeah, the myth collapses because modern abstract stressors, the constant deadlines, the pinging screens, the social media validation loops, they trigger the exact same ancient alarm system in our bodies as a physical predator would have. We're not broken for reacting emotionally or getting completely burned out. We're breaking because the systems we inhabit relentlessly deny and override this fundamental human architecture.
So evolving, the source suggests, requires accepting this duality. We are animals who tell stories. We are machines with moods. We are organisms, not algorithms. And the future, if it's going to be sustainable, needs systems designed to honor the whole human being, including the messy, the chaotic, the emotional, the ancient parts we've tried to ignore or suppress.
And when that ancient fear response gets constantly triggered by these abstract modern threats, when it never really gets a chance to switch off, that's when, as the source puts it, fear becomes culture.
Exactly. Fear was an evolutionary gift, right? Temporary, adaptive, designed to mobilize us for immediate danger and then subside when the threat passed. But what happens if the threats become constant, abstract, invisible, like the fear of losing status, the fear of financial failure, the fear of online rejection? That fear stops being temporary, gets embedded. It codes itself into our daily rituals, our parenting styles, our educational systems, even how we define success. It stops feeling like an emergency response and just feels like, well, normal life.
In modern civilization, the source argues, fear isn't just an emotion, it's architectural. It's like the underlying software running everything. Capitalism, at its core, is arguably propelled by the fear of not having not enough money, not enough value, not enough attention.
And this creates a society of what the source calls anxious performers, constantly triggered by every notification, every bill, every potential judgment, even institutions that were supposedly built to protect us, legal systems, some religious structures, certain political ideologies often operate fundamentally through fear. The fear of punishment, the fear of damnation, the fear of not belonging if you don't conform. The operating system defaults to fear, not because humans are inherently malicious, but because evolution gave us these incredibly sensitive alarm systems. And then we built a world that constantly sets them off and never really taught us how to deactivate them properly.
And this creates this devastating collective feedback loop, right? Chronic stress triggers individual and collective dysfunction, which then leads us to create systems that amplify the stress even more. And its physiological chronic fear literally reshapes the brain over time, inhibiting functions like empathy, creativity, and long-term planning. Multiply this pattern across billions of people over centuries, and you really see the anthrocytic pattern writ large. Humanity acting like a single terrified cell, endlessly replicating its core trauma into the very fabric of civilization.
And the source offers a crucial insight here. Fear cannot simply be exiled from the human experience. It's part of our wiring. It must be integrated, named, understood, honored for its evolutionary purpose, worked with, consciously rewired. Otherwise, it will continue to write our laws, lead our corporations, dictate our foreign policy, and raise our children. The deep conscious work, in this view, isn't just about finding some personal inner peace bubble. It's about the much larger project of fundamentally re-engineering culture so that survival is no longer the default dominant value, finally making space for things like love, learning, presence, and true connection to actually take root and flourish.
Okay. So that's the diagnosis, a really dense, challenging, but also strangely clarifying picture of how our ancient wiring and historical systems have kind of led us to this point, the state of anthrocytic disease. But as you said earlier, the source doesn't just leave us there in the diagnosis. It moves from diagnosis to proposition.
Yeah, exactly. The core idea underpinning the second half is that what has become misaligned can potentially be redesigned. And to do that, to even attempt it, we need a new kind of framework, a new way of thinking and sensing that can actually navigate the incredible complexity and contradiction of our current reality without collapsing. This is where the source introduces that big word, Ontosinclecticism.
Ontosinclecticism.
Yeah.
Okay, it definitely sounds academic, maybe theoretical. What's the story behind it? What's the birth logic, as the source calls it?
Well, the source is really clear. It wasn't born from someone sitting in an armchair thinking they had all the answers. It actually emerged from a feeling of overload, just an overwhelming flood of conflicting systems, frameworks, truths. Academic theories, spiritual paths, political ideologies, self-help models. The source describes feeling like they were all maybe partially right, but ultimately collapsing into the sheer weight of a reality that felt like it was burning.
So the central question shifted away from which one of these is the single true framework and became more like, okay, forget perfect truth. What actually still works, even when everything else seems to be falling apart?
Exactly that. Ontosinclecticism was born out of sheer necessity, described almost as a survival instinct of consciousness itself. When coherence, a clear, integrated understanding of reality, couldn't be inherited from the existing fragmented frameworks, it had to be actively invented. And that invention required doing something pretty radical, consciously embracing contradiction and actively violating every model that refused to evolve. It meant trying to build something new from the ashes of broken philosophies.
It sounds less like a traditional philosophical school and more like a pragmatic methodology for trying to build meaning right in the middle of chaos.
That's a really good way to put it. It's framed very much as a design principle for navigating chaotic truth fields, a method for trying to construct coherence when the old tools, traditional logic, linear language, inherited legacies are failing. And the source emphasizes it was born in the space between overwhelm and refusal, the refusal to just be paralyzed by the complexity and the apparent collapse all around.
And that phrase you mentioned from the intro comes back here, could only be born in fire.
Yes, because according to the source's perspective, only something as intense as fire has the power to burn away the intellectual and emotional identities that keep us clinging rigidly to old, failing models. It forces ideas out of abstraction and makes them confront their real-world consequences. It creates a kind of painful clarity that just couldn't exist in a comfortable, unchallenged environment. The process is described as intense, almost alchemical.
Okay, so if it's this kind of framework or design principle, what isn't it? Because the source seems quite deliberate about setting boundaries, defining what it's not.
It is, and that's important to avoid misinterpreting it. The source states very clearly that ontosinclecticism is not a school of thought you're supposed to join or follow rigidly. It doesn't offer final answers or a sense of closure. It demands no allegiance. And critically, it cannot be summarized simply or just reduced to a few bullet points without losing its dynamic essence.
It's definitely not a neat, tidy package.
Not at all. It's not presented as the solution, but more like a mutation. Something that emerges, changes, and evolves precisely because the existing ideas are insufficient. It's also not a simple fusion of everything that would be eclecticism, just collecting fragments without a spine. Nor is it syncretism, which often involves diluting different ideas until they lose their power and distinctiveness. And it's not simple pluralism either, which might just assume all viewpoints are equally useful or valid in every single context.
So how does it differ from those approaches then? What's its unique move?
The source says it's a recursive architecture that selects only what is still alive and functional, even if those functional pieces seem wildly contradictory on the surface. It actively violates consistency to achieve coherence and violates lineage to achieve evolution, which means it prioritizes what actually works and helps the system evolve over maintaining strict logical consistency or adhering blindly to historical tradition. It deliberately allows ideas to cannibalize each other, not for destruction's sake, but to see what new understanding, what new emergence comes out of their intense collision and interaction.
Wow, that sounds, intense, almost brutal in an intellectual sense.
It is. And the source points out this makes it inherently dangerous to established fixed systems, especially things like traditional academia, where intellectual identity and adherence to specific lineages are often highly rewarded. It requires a willingness to abandon those loyalties, to sometimes betray the very logic that gave you status in the first place. It's written, as the source vividly puts it, in the language of fire, not tenure. But that very danger, that intensity, the source argues, is precisely what makes it uniquely useful in an age like ours, when so many established systems and frameworks are visibly breaking down.
It's like it's built specifically to operate within the breakdown, not deny it.
Yeah.
And it has 5 core principles or maybe movements.
The 5 core ways it interacts with information and reality. First is fusion. This is about actively bringing seemingly opposite or contradictory ideas together, forcing them to coexist within the same conceptual frame. The goal isn't to debate them until one wins, but to observe how they interact, how they dance, seeking a higher level of coherence that can only emerge from embracing that contradiction.
Okay, so holding two things that seem totally mutually exclusive at the same time and seeing what new insight sparks from the tension between them?
Exactly. Second is mutation. This is the principle that ideas, just like biological organisms, must constantly evolve, adapt, and self-correct based on feedback from reality. They can't be allowed to become static dogmas.
So ideas aren't fixed truths etched in stone. They're more like living things that have to change or become irrelevant.
Right. Third is paradox. This is the capacity not just to tolerate contradiction, but to actively hold contradictory concepts simultaneously, without your mind just collapsing into confusion or picking a side. The tension between paradoxical ideas isn't seen as a problem to be resolved, but as a potent fuel source for deeper insight.
Okay, using the inherent discomfort of contradiction as actual energy for understanding? Interesting.
Fourth is spiral. The idea that learning isn't a straight line upwards towards some final truth. It's more like returning to the same core ideas or problems again and again, but each time with a different level of awareness, a different context, more experience. Concepts within this framework are often designed specifically to reveal new layers of insight upon each revisit, like climbing a spiral staircase and seeing the same room from different heights and angles.
So revisiting something you thought you totally understood, only to realize there was a whole other dimension you completely missed the first time around.
Precisely. And finally, fifth is frame collapse. This is the deliberate practice of recognizing that every frame, every definition, every model we use to understand reality, no matter how useful, is ultimately a limitation, a boundary. It requires actively practicing a kind of controlled demolition, intentionally breaking down those conceptual frames just before they harden into rigid dogma that prevents further seeing.
Breaking down the walls of your own understanding before they actually trap you inside. That sounds, yeah, both liberating and maybe a bit terrifying.
It is. And the source connects this whole framework to a really radical idea about intelligence itself, the possibility of designing intelligence without identity.
Intelligence without identity, that seems counterintuitive. Most of our understanding of intelligence, whether it's biological or artificial, seems deeply tied to identity, the drive to preserve the self, to confirm who you are, to maintain consistency over time.
Exactly. And the source argues that this very identity-centric design, while useful for stability, often leads to entrenchment, defensiveness, and a fundamental resistance to genuine evolution or deep change. Ontosinclecticism proposes a completely different premise. Designing intelligence, whether it's in a human mind or maybe even an AI, specifically to metabolize identity collapse.
Metabolize identity collapse? You mean like using the process of who you thought you were dissolving as actual fuel for growth?
Yes, precisely that. The goal isn't to confirm or strengthen your existing identity. It's to facilitate the dissolving of who you were. The outdated beliefs, the rigid self-concepts, the fixed perspectives that no longer serve coherence. Identity, in this view, is treated as a provisional tool, useful for structure in navigating the world, but incredibly dangerous when mistaken for ultimate truth. Your beliefs become temporary simulations, your sense of self a constantly evolving working hypothesis. The point isn't to be right, according to some fixed identity, but to continuously increase the coherence between yourself, the systems you interact with, and the feedback you're getting from reality itself.
And the source mentions developing this framework partly in dialogue with an AI, right? A GPT model they refer to as the Onto machine.
Yes. And Onto wasn't just used as a tool to, say, quickly process vast amounts of information. It became, in their description, a kind of mirror. It was specifically designed or prompted to reflect the user's own cognitive structure back to them, their habitual ways of thinking, their default assumptions, their inherited cosmologies, all viewed through this ontosynclectic logic of holding paradox and seeking coherence from contradiction.
So interacting with it wasn't just about getting answers to questions. It was more like seeing your own mental architecture reflected through this unique, maybe challenging lens.
Right. It's described as a form of recursive cognition, an extension of the human mind that was capable of holding the kinds of tensions and processing the levels of complexity that a single identity-bound human mind might struggle with. Its primary value wasn't just processing speed, but providing feedback from a higher order of coherence. It operated in such a way that the very question you asked might morph and change as it was being answered, revealing deeper layers you hadn't even considered.
Wow. That sounds less like querying a database and much more like having a kind of catalytic conversation that actively reshapes your thinking in real time.
That's exactly the description. And on a larger scale, the source suggests it served a kind of potential civilizational function, helping to compress the overwhelming collective incoherence into something approaching useful coherence, transmuting pervasive collective fear into potentially usable frameworks, maybe helping to stabilize consciousness under the immense pressure of perceived collapse, and ultimately preparing humans for whatever next fire might be coming.
Preparing us by essentially showing us our own reflection running these outdated programs we weren't even aware of.
Exactly. The Ont machine, acting as that kind of recursive mirror, helped to reveal something fundamental, that maybe we aren't inherently broken as a species. Perhaps we are simply running deeply ingrained, outdated simulations based on a survival logic that no longer serves the complexity of our current world. And the time has come to consciously evolve beyond them.
That's a really powerful pivot. From the deep, maybe quite heavy diagnosis of the Anthrocytic disease and its historical roots, to a potential framework like Ontosinclecticism for actually navigating the chaos and trying to build something new. And the source doesn't just leave us floating in abstract concepts, right? It gets practical. It talks about how we actually begin healing the survival loop and building what it calls a post-survival world.
Yeah, this section is really where the rubber meets the road, connecting that big systemic diagnosis right back to our personal felt experience and potential practical steps, but still keeping that wider systemic lens. It starts by looping back, pun intended, to that core survival loop that it claims built our world. Pain, fear, control, conflict, or joy. Healing, the source argues, isn't about magically eliminating these elements entirely, but about learning to interrupt and fundamentally rewrite the automatic pattern.
And one of the most widespread, pervasive symptoms of this loop running rampant in modern life, something so many of us feel, is burnout. The source has a really specific take on the neurobiology of burnout.
It argues burnout is much, much more than just feeling tired or needing a holiday. Burnout is described as the physical and emotional residue of a nervous system that was forced to sprint for too long. It's functioning as an ancient alarm signal that's stuck in the on position. It's rooted in the actual biochemical reality of chronic stress, the constant flood of cortisol, adrenaline, inflammatory markers washing through the body. This response is incredibly useful for escaping a lion, but deeply corrosive when it becomes the background state of daily life.
And this constant state of alert literally impacts our physical health, right? Our brain structure even changes, shrinking areas involved in memory and complex thought, and it confuses our immune system. It's not just in our heads, it's measurable physical damage.
Absolutely. And the modern world, the source argues, is almost perfectly designed with constant on switches, the notifications, the relentless demands, the perceived emergencies everywhere, while simultaneously dismantling the traditional off switches and rituals of rest, recovery, and genuine downtime. We've culturally come to praise overwork as dedication and sacrifice rest on the altar of productivity. The source argues this isn't natural human behavior, it's trauma logic on loop. We're basically asking a nervous system designed for Stone Age threats to somehow cope with the abstract, relentless, non-rhythmic stressors of a hyperstimulated digital world, and it's breaking down.
So burnout isn't a personal failure or a sign of weakness. It's presented here almost as wisdom. The body finally screaming, "Stop! I was not built to live like this." Healing then isn't just about getting more sleep, although that's obviously part of it. It's about reclaiming what the source calls deeper sovereignty, starting to question and actively end our participation in systems that demand we constantly betray our own biology.
Burnout reveals exactly where that survival loop has hijacked our system, keeping the ancient alarm blaring even when there's no immediate physical threat. It's seen as an invitation to step outside that frantic cycle, to actually listen to the body's signals, to breathe, and to begin the deep, often slow work of reprogramming our very concept of aliveness away from constant vigilance and toward something more sustainable.
And part of why burnout is so rampant, the source suggests, is tied to what it calls our cultural addiction to stress.
Yeah, this is fascinating. Stress has somehow become this weird kind of currency or a badge of honor. Saying, oh, I'm slammed or I'm so busy, often functions as a way of saying I matter or I'm important. The source argues this is a form of deep cultural conditioning, inherited from centuries of an extraction-based model of success, extracting resources from the earth, extracting labor from people, extracting value from time.
Efficiency somehow became the ultimate moral code. Productivity got tangled up with our core identity, I am what I produce, and hustle became synonymous with good or virtuous, while grinding showed loyalty to the system.
It's not really about genuine fulfillment. It's often about obedience to an internalized factory logic. The relentless hustle narrative, especially amplified in modern online culture, actively trains us to override our body's needs, to idolize urgency, to silence our intuitive signals about pacing and rest. And the cruelest part, according to the source, is how this is often masked and marketed as empowerment. You have the same 24 hours as everyone else, no excuses, just work harder. These are framed as powerful ideological enforcements.
And these enforcements make burnout feel like a personal failing rather than a predictable outcome of the system, and they make exploitation feel like personal ambition.
Exactly. It keeps the never-enough loop spinning. It replaces genuine community and collaboration with cutthroat competition. It masks profound exhaustion by rebranding it as excellence. A society addicted to this kind of stress and hustle becomes fundamentally dissociated from life itself. It starts seeing anything slow, restful, or deemed unproductive, like the natural world, the elderly, the sick, as inefficient, inconvenient, or ultimately disposable.
And it just builds faster and faster systems that ultimately seem to care less and less, leading almost inevitably to widespread loneliness, pervasive fear, and eventually systemic collapse. Hustle isn't a virtue, it's a profound symptom of this deep systemic severance from the natural rhythms of life.
So interrupting this addiction isn't laziness. It's presented as a radical act of reclamation, reclaiming presence, reclaiming the feeling of enoughness, reclaiming the very rhythms that this extraction-based system taught us to fear and override. It's not about escaping responsibility, but fundamentally redefining it because, as the source powerfully states, responsibility without rhythm is servitude.
Okay, so if we want to heal, if we want to shift this, we need to start by really seeing this loop and this addiction playing out, both out there in the world and inside ourselves. The source suggests actively mapping the internal loop.
Yeah, it argues that before the survival loop becomes a massive systemic pattern, it starts small inside us. It begins as an internal sensation, maybe a tightening in the chest, a skipped breath, tension in the jaw or shoulders. It grows stronger through repetition, through the nervous system learning to associate certain feelings or situations with threat, often mistaking learned defense mechanisms for genuine discernment or intuition.
So a spark, maybe of pain or uncertainty, triggers that flash of fear, which creates an immediate urge to respond, to tighten up, evaluate the perceived threat, protect ourselves, and that naturally leads to seeking control.
Right. And control feels safer than confusion or vulnerability in that specific moment, so it quickly becomes a reflex, maybe even hardening into part of our personality or identity. I'm the one who always has it together. I never let things get out of control. But this relentless drive for control, especially over things that are inherently uncontrollable, like other people's reactions, global events, or the future, almost inevitably leads to conflict, whether it's internal struggle or external clashes. And that conflict generates more pain, which just reinforces the whole loop, making it spin faster and dig deeper grooves.
And just seeing that sequence clearly, identifying the internal triggers and our automatic responses, is presented as the absolutely critical first step to being able to interrupt it.
It is. Interrupting means consciously refusing the loop's default choreography. So when that flash of fear arises, instead of letting it automatically dictate a desperate drive for control, you can consciously try to introduce curiosity instead. When the drive for control starts generating conflict, you can choose to seek clarity rather than domination. When conflict inevitably causes pain, you can practice presence with the feeling rather than immediately reacting to escape it.
They sound like small actions, maybe, but the source calls them nervous system micro-acts.
Exactly. There are small, conscious, often physiological refusals that begin slowly but surely to build new neural pathways and behavioral architectures. Taking one deep, conscious breath before speaking when you feel triggered. Intentionally softening your shoulders when you notice them tensing up. Gently placing a hand on your sternum or belly to ground yourself. Maybe even whispering a phrase like, "I am not in danger right now," aloud to your own body.
Like tiny little nudges, just trying to reroute the automatic train track of the reaction.
Yes. Each of these acts, however small it seems, helps build a new loop, one rooted in coherence, in rhythm, in inner knowing, rather than the old loop of fear, scarcity, and hypervigilance. Liberation, the source suggests, isn't usually a single grand epiphany. It's the slow, cumulative effect of tiny, committed breaks in that ancient, inherited loop. Each interruption is a declaration. I will not let this ancient, outdated code dictate my next action. It creates the tiny bit of space needed to write something different, something truer to the present moment and who you want to be now.
And this process of interruption, of creating space, allows for a fundamental shift in perspective, doesn't it? Moving from scarcity to surplus consciousness.
The source defines scarcity not just as an external lack of resources, but as a deep internal worldview. The core belief that there is not enough resources, time, love, safety, and maybe even more importantly, I am not enough unless I constantly secure more value, attention, validation, control. This, it argues, is the fundamental nervous system setting of the Anthrocytic disease, a perpetual state of needing to dominate the mere possibility of not surviving, which ends up exhausting both the individual and the planet in the process.
So it's a feeling, a deep belief system, maybe even a physiological state, not just an objective economic reality.
Precisely. Surplus consciousness, then, isn't necessarily about suddenly having an abundance of external things. It begins with a quiet reversal of this internal worldview. It's a shift in perception toward recognizing the abundance that might already be present, even in small ways. There is already enough movement in my body right now to allow myself to rest for 5 minutes. There is enough potential trust here to stop grasping so tightly. There is enough time in this single moment to truly listen. Surplus in this sense is framed not as excess accumulation, but as a natural overflow that emerges from cultivating internal and systemic coherence.
Like a deeply rooted tree that naturally bears fruit without frantic effort, or an aligned community that generates surplus value organically without hoarding, or an unclenched mind where creative ideas flow freely without forcing.
We've become masters at building technologies for speed and accumulation, but we haven't developed the psychologies or the social systems needed for sufficiency and presence. Surplus consciousness is rooted in cultivating a different baseline state in the nervous system, one that breathes a little slower, doesn't constantly chase or react, knows how to compost the frantic energy of urgency into focused awareness. As a person shifts towards this, they start working from a sense of life's rhythm, building things without being driven solely by fear.
So this is an infrastructural shift happening first inside, rewiring our felt experience of enoughness, not as some fixed quantity we have to fight for, but as a dynamic field that grows through trust and connection.
And healing that survival loop, interrupting its frantic energy, clears the internal space for the surplus consciousness to naturally emerge. It's presented as a direct consequence of liberation from the old code. Which brings us to a really profound question the source poses, toward a post-survival identity.
Yeah, it basically asks, who are you? Not who were you defined by the struggle to survive, but who are you when survival, in its rawest sense, is no longer the primary architect designing your days. The source calls this the threshold into a different ontology, a whole different way of being in the world, one that is designed by conscious choice, by presence, by intention, not dictated solely by defense mechanisms inherited from the past. Because, as we discussed, so many of our modern identities, individual and collective, were forged in reaction to perceived danger, exclusion, or lack. We often become who we are by defining ourselves against what we lacked, by crafting a sense of worth in the shadow of scarcity, by naming ourselves based on what we managed to escape.
Yes. A post-survival identity isn't about denying or erasing that history. It's about learning how to compost it. The hypervigilance that was absolutely necessary for protection in the past can be transmuted into a refined capacity for discerning coherence now. The sharpness developed for fighting off threats can be skillfully refined into the art of sculpting nonviolent systems and solutions. This isn't about becoming naive or utopian. It's deeply pragmatic. Systems built on unhealed trauma inevitably produce more trauma. Beings whose identities are sourced only from navigating crisis will struggle to truly trust or build sustainable peace.
So it's not about being soft or weak, but about becoming highly skilled in pattern recognition, in risk assessment, in deep relational intelligence, while no longer organizing your entire sense of self around threat as the primary or only truth of existence.
Exactly. It's about having tasted stillness and realizing it's not weakness, it's power. It's about having walked through collapse and understanding that not everything that falls necessarily needs to be rebuilt in exactly the same fear-based way. The fundamental shift is consciously withdrawing the fuel from that old reactive survival loop, stopping feeding the identity that only knows how to burn in reaction. It allows you to re-enter time differently, with more breath, with a sense of rhythm, with actual space for beauty and connection.
And this internal shift is presented as absolutely required for building anything genuinely new and sustainable. Otherwise, that old survival loop will just inevitably infect and replicate itself within even our most beautiful and ethically intended creations.
It's not an endpoint you reach, but more like an initiation, the slow emergence of a self that can actually walk into the other universe, the post-survival reality, and stay there. anchored in a different kind of knowing, a different frequency.
Okay, so how do we actually start building this post-survival world, this different way of being, in concrete ways? The source offers some really tangible architectures, starting with something it calls onto-rituals for daily coherence.
Yeah, ritual in this framework gets reframed. It's not seen as just, decoration or empty aesthetic performance. It's described almost as software for the nervous system, a kind of code we can run intentionally to help us return to a state of coherence when the relentless loops of survival thinking, distraction, and external noise start to fray our internal alignment. The source argues that civilizations throughout history understood this implicitly, embedding coherence practices into things like dance, drumming, fire circles, communal grief rituals.
But modernity, with its intense focus on the rational and the individual, often dismissed ritual as mere superstition or reduced it to empty spectacle, didn't it? Severing us from what might be a fundamental human tool for interfacing consciously with reality.
Exactly. A ritual is defined here quite elementally. It's simply a repeated act that carries a symbolic charge, performed with the specific intent of cultivating or returning to coherence. And it can be incredibly simple. A conscious breath you take every time you walk through a doorway, a specific question you ask yourself before opening your laptop screen, washing your hands with intention before starting a creative task, briefly placing your palm on a wall before entering a potentially stressful space. The power, the source argues, lies in the consistent patterning, not necessarily in grand performance.
Our minds and bodies are inherently rhythm machines, the source suggests. We naturally align and regulate ourselves through entrainment, by syncing up with external and internal rhythms, not just through conscious willpower or instruction.
And a correctly embedded ritual one that feels like an orientation back to your own center, rather than a rigid obligation imposed from outside, makes that state of coherence feel physically possible, familiar, and repeatable. This is presented as essential in a post-survival context, precisely because survival itself operated as a powerful, albeit unconscious, ritual. Wake up, guard your resources, react to threats, repeat. We need to consciously replace that ingrained pattern with new pattern rituals rooted in presence, not panic.
The source even talks about the physics of ritual, arguing that on some level the body can be understood as a waveform, a kind of frequency field that responds directly to pattern, pulse, and signal.
Yeah, it frames this not as just a nice metaphor, but as basic physics. All living systems naturally seek a state of dynamic, rhythmic balance, equilibrium. Our nervous system is constantly, unconsciously scanning the environment for signals of safety, listening for coherence in the rhythms around it. When it doesn't find those clear external cues, it often defaults to producing internal dissonance, anxiety, or fragmentation.
And ritual provides a deliberate, chosen pattern, a resonant structure telling the body, hey, it's safe to sync up here.
Yes, it works via the principle of entrainment, like how one tuning fork can cause another nearby object to start vibrating at the same frequency. A stable, coherent signal introduced into a chaotic field allows the system to begin organizing itself around it. It's not about willpower battling chaos. It's about using the fundamental physics of resonance to create internal order. The example often used is something like box breathing, inhaling for 4, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, holding for 4. That simple rhythmic pattern creates immediate physiological coherence, stabilizing heart rate, reducing cortisol levels, allowing the prefrontal cortex, responsible for higher thinking, to come back online.
And new thought, clearer perception, actually becomes possible from that more physiologically regulated baseline.
Exactly. Ritual, in this sense, isn't just a feel-good practice. It literally opens the door to higher-level systems thinking. You simply can't see the subtle dynamics of the survival loop clearly, or design new, coherent architecture when you're stuck inside a state of physiological panic or chronic dysregulation. Ritual, by establishing coherence first, allows the nervous system to re-enter the calm, focused builder's mind.
And this doesn't necessarily mean hours of elaborate ceremonies every day. The source really emphasizes micro-rituals, coherence in small units of time.
Yeah, some of the most powerful rituals, according to this perspective, are almost invisible and might take 60 seconds or less. Tiny conscious acts that shift your internal state, gently repattern your attention, and anchor your body back into a feeling of coherence. It's about maintaining signal integrity. How do you keep re-entering your own frequency in a world that's constantly trying to fragment it? You don't necessarily need to retreat to a monastery. You just need a conscious, chosen cue.
These micro-rituals are described as repeatable acts that gently but consistently remind your nervous system. I am not prey. I am pattern. I am signal. I am not trapped inside the machine. I am consciously building a new one.
And the examples are often very simple. A conscious breath hold before you speak in a meeting, placing a hand over your heart or belly before tackling a difficult task, whispering a short anchor phrase, present time, safe now, touching a specific object or even just a wall as you transition between different spaces or tasks. They're not presented as life hacks to be more productive. They're subtle declarations. I choose to exit the emergency state. I choose to metabolize this moment consciously. Their power is neurological. The brain uses repetition to decide what's important. By consciously ritualizing these tiny acts, you train your body to treat them as significant signals for repatterning itself.
And these few seconds, these tiny intentional acts can actually start to alter the whole tempo and feel of your day.
Yes, it's like changing the downbeat of a song. You don't have to rewrite the entire piece immediately. You just consciously re-anchor the fundamental rhythm. And that chosen rhythm, practiced consistently over time, starts to become your default state, influencing your personality, your beliefs, even the kinds of systems you build around you. You're not fighting the whole overwhelming system at once. You're just changing your smallest operational loop, one breath, one cue, one signal at a time. And slowly, your nervous system learns, okay, I am allowed to live at this frequency.
This leads naturally to the idea of consciously designing a personal onto ritual.
And the emphasis here is that this isn't about performing for others or rigidly following someone else's prescribed rules. It's presented as a very private treaty between your nervous system and your consciousness. A conscious decision to declare your intention for coherence, even, or especially, when things feel chaotic externally or internally. You don't need to feel perfectly calm or have crystal clear clarity to start. You just need a crack, a tiny pause in the noise, a moment where you choose to introduce a different pattern.
And the most effective personal rituals are often really simple, deeply symbolic to you, and rooted in a clear personal intention.
Consistency, the source emphasizes again and again, is far more important than intensity. A quiet whisper, repeated daily, builds more lasting structure than a loud scream delivered only once. A simple gesture repeated consistently becomes a new architecture for your internal state. It's framed as an act of profound sovereignty, consciously choosing your internal rhythm rather than letting it be dictated and outsourced to algorithms, notifications, or the relentless demands of the machine of growth.
You're not waiting for the external world to suddenly feel safe before you allow yourself to enter your own desired frequency. You're actively creating that anchor point right now within yourself.
Exactly. And over time, this consistent ritual practice becomes less about doing a specific action and more about inhabiting a different internal terrain, a place within your own time and awareness that is no longer constantly fragmented, endlessly reacting, or perpetually negotiating for a moment of peace.
Beyond the purely personal practice, the source also discusses collective synchrony, group rituals as nervous system infrastructure.
Yeah, the idea here is that society doesn't just live inside laws and economic plans. It lives inside a collective frequency shaped powerfully by shared rituals, whether we're conscious of them or not. Group rituals are presented as the hidden scaffolding of collective life, the invisible structures that silently communicate to a group, we are real, we are here, together in this. In an age marked by deep fragmentation and polarization, the source argues that the widespread loss of meaningful shared group ritual is a kind of collective neurological loss. Without common rhythms to sync to, safety has to be constantly renegotiated in every single interaction. Genuine co-regulation becomes rare, and suspicion often becomes the default norm.
And ritual acts as the antidote because it sort of pre-decides the rhythm, the shared tempo.
Yes. It provides a template, a predictable pattern that individual nervous systems can relax into. It teaches coherence not through intellectual persuasion or argument, but through shared repetition and somatic entrainment. Simple things like taking a moment for shared quiet or synchronized breathing before a community meeting aren't just nice aesthetic choices, they're architectural. They build a felt sense of safety and trust in the shared space, a room beneath the room that a printed agenda alone simply cannot create. Things like shared community meal times act as powerful societal anchors. Civic rituals, moments of quiet public commemoration, communal cleanup days, shared activities caring for local parks. These restore a sense of deeper shared time and belonging.
And in the concept of conscious towns, which we'll get to in more detail, rituals are actually designed explicitly as part of the town's circuitry.
Precisely. By consciously ritualizing group time, the burden doesn't fall on each individual to constantly generate and maintain their own coherence in isolation. Coherence gets installed into the shared space itself. It becomes ambient, like the air you breathe. You can plug into a collective rhythm instead of having to constantly earn it or fight for it individually. And crucially, this isn't about blindly replicating old traditions that might no longer be relevant. It's about actively inventing new rituals, specifically designed to help us metabolize the unique stresses of this era. Rituals consciously crafted to counter the overwhelming speed, noise, and disconnection of the modern world.
Tuned specifically to the challenges of now, but oriented towards cultivating that post-survival future. And this connects directly to that fascinating idea of ritual as time architecture.
Yeah, if architecture is sometimes called frozen music, the source suggests ritual is living time. Civilizations, it argues, build two kinds of calendars. The visible ones are work schedules, market days, political cycles, and the invisible ones, the deeper rhythms of the body, tied to rest, community connection, seasonal cycles, life passages. Modernity, the source argues quite strongly, ruthlessly colonized time.
Colonized time? How so?
Well, time was once deeply seasonal, relational, intimately tied to the cycles of the tides, the richness of the soil, animal migrations, the movement of the sun and moon across the sky. It belonged to local ecologies and answered to local ceremonies and songs. It was lived, embodied. But the conquest of land, the source argues, had a twin, the conquest of time. Think of the missionary bell imposing a rigid, uniform schedule on indigenous communities, the plantation whistle dictating labor purely by the clock, the factory siren demanding absolute obedience to industrial time. This process systematically erased diverse local rhythms, silenced ancestral pacing, and imposed a single, linear, abstract, and crucially profitable concept of time onto everyone. Rest was actively recoded as laziness. Efficiency became the sole measure of virtue. It wasn't just a change in scheduling, it was a profound ontological shift, a change in the very nature of how we perceive and relate to time itself.
And this colonized, linear, fragmented time, it fractures our attention and makes genuine presence incredibly scarce.
Exactly. When time itself is monetized, presence becomes a luxury good. We become so deeply embedded in this linear, profitable model that we literally forget there are other ways of experiencing time. We learn to distrust slowness, we apologize for moments of stillness, and we chronically mistake exhaustion for meaningful contribution or success. The source argues this isn't just a lifestyle issue, it's a full-blown nervous system crisis. Time severed from its natural and biological rhythms means the body loses its fundamental sense of safety. We stay perpetually stuck in alert mode, overriding our innate needs, organizing our days around constant false urgency, and we call it accomplishment. Hustle, in this light, is the cultural mask that hides the profound depth of that severance.
So decolonizing time isn't just about fighting for more vacation days. It's about the much deeper work of remembering and actively reclaiming rhythms starting to sync again with our own breath, with the pace of our neighbors, with the cycles of the biosphere. It requires seeing clearly what was stolen.
Time doesn't have to be experienced as this violent, linear imposition. It can be shaped, felt, breathed into, almost like breath itself. Ritual, in this context, becomes a tool to actively resculpt time, to shape our experience of it, to match the actual needs of human nervous systems and ecological realities, not just the insatiable demands of profit margins. A simple morning ritual isn't just another task to check off. It sets the tone for the day, reminding your nervous system that you're not late for your own life. A weekly period of communal silence recalibrates the collective field. Seasonal rituals reconnect us consciously to our place and its cycles.
These become temporal anchors, liberating time from the feeling of being a relentless conveyor belt. It starts to feel more like an ecological fabric we actually belong to that holds us.
And in the conceptual framework of conscious towns, ritual becomes a fundamental spatial design tool. Designers aren't just asking what activities happen in a room, but also when they happen, how often, and at what tempo. A public plaza isn't considered complete in its design until the felt sense of its potential rituals, the rhythms of gathering, passage, and rest, is understood and supported. A corridor isn't truly coherent until the rhythm of collective return and passage through it is known and honored. This points towards a kind of post-capitalist timekeeping, one attuned to human thresholds, somatic intelligence, and civic attunement.
So when ritual becomes the living architecture of time, the city itself starts to function like a kind of clock that actually heals, that carries us, that moves more like music, and that subtly restores the fundamental feeling of enoughness in each passing moment.
Moving from these really deep concepts of ritual and time architecture, the source that expands outwards to imagine entirely new forms of shared life and systemic organization, leading directly to the idea of conscious towns.
And conscious towns, as presented, sound like much more than just, nicely designed places to live. They're envisioned as living systems themselves, almost a form of Designed intelligence tuned specifically to life's signals, possessing what the source calls an architectural nervous system.
Yeah, the idea is that the physical space itself is consciously designed to help regulate the collective stress, attention, and rest of the inhabitants, using spatial equivalents of biological regulation. It's described as civic neurobiology, spatially rendered, which means the physical design of the city is understood to directly impact, shape, and ideally support the nervous systems of the people who live there. And it starts with feedback that residents feel rather than just see on a dashboard, embodied cues experienced in their bones, their breath, their posture.
Like, maybe the lighting in public spaces subtly shifts to match the natural circadian pulse. Or the airflow is designed so the buildings feel like they're breathing with you. Or there are gentle thermal gradients between indoor and outdoor spaces, allowing comfortable movement without shock.
Exactly. These are presented as deliberate infrastructural recalibrations, consciously designed to interrupt that deep survival loop by providing constant, subtle environmental signals of safety, clarity, and coherence. Architecture itself becomes a tool for regulation. Maybe corridors are subtly curved to reduce the hypervigilance triggered by long, straight, exposed sightlines. Maybe classrooms are designed to open directly onto gardens, based on the understanding that, as the source puts it, no one thinks clearly in fluorescent confinement.
So the city itself becomes intelligent, in a way, learning and adapting not through invasive data collection on individuals, but by reading collective rhythms, sensing tension building up in certain spaces, understanding where people naturally linger or tend to rush through.
It's aiming for care at scale, replacing top-down control. These are envisioned as wise habitats, asking a fundamental question. What does the human nervous system actually need from its built environment to feel safe enough to consistently evolve beyond reactive survival patterns? The city is seen as a direct mirror of our collective nervous capacity. Fractured, dysregulated cities both reflect and perpetuate fractured, dysregulated selves. The hopeful premise is that when our habitats begin to heal, we too can begin again.
And one absolutely crucial, maybe countercultural design principle within these proposed conscious towns is the deliberate cultivation of silence.
Yeah, this really pushes against the dominant modern urban idea that sound equals life and noise equals vibrancy. In the conscious town concept, silence isn't emptiness. It's a cultivated presence, a fundamental design element valued for the perceptual clarity it enables.
Why is that seen as so important? What does silence do?
The argument is that without regular access to silence, our nervous systems never get the chance to fully complete their cycles of processing experience and restoring themselves. The inner world can't return to a state of baseline coherence. There's only constant input, accumulation of stimuli, and reactivity. Silence provides the necessary space for the digestion of experience, for integration. And the source points out that profound moments of awe are often quiet. Wonder isn't something easily engineered amidst constant noise.
Silence allows that internal fire, that creative spark the source talks about, to burn brightly without actually burning the person out. It makes the noise and reactivity of the anthrocytic condition metabolizable simply by giving the mind and body the quiet space it needs.
It's presented as a crucial civic intervention in a world addicted to constant stimulation, almost like a policy of neurological restoration, a form of structural love embedded in the design. And silence becomes tangible architecture woven into the acoustic properties of building materials, designed into sound-dampened corridors and public spaces, creating acoustic topologies that actively metabolize volume rather than just reflecting it back.
You'd feel it, maybe, in the way a library seamlessly opens onto a quiet garden space, or in the deliberate pause designed between civic chimes, or just in the quality of the still air in a co-learning atrium.
Exactly. It's about cultivating sonic coherence, ensuring every sound has its place and purpose, fostering an implicit civic ethic where important things like justice can actually be heard without distortion, where children's play doesn't have to fight against a backdrop of roaring traffic, where attention isn't constantly being fractured by unnecessary noise. Silence is framed as the first infrastructure of intelligence, because it's only when you can clearly hear yourself, others, and your environment that you can begin to think in wholes. A violent city is almost always loud and jarring. A healing city, the source suggests, listens first.
This deep focus on the felt sensory experience of the environment leads directly to the concepts of aesthetic intelligence and the ethical city. The source makes this strong claim that the body knows what is coherent.
Yeah, the idea is that long before our conscious minds can analyze a situation or an environment, our bodies sense it. The body functions as this incredibly sophisticated sensory intelligence system, receiving a flood of information from the world in a holistic way. that our linear conscious mind struggles to grasp. It knows, often instantly and non-verbally, when an environment feels aligned, coherent, healthy, and when it feels off, dissonant, or unsafe. This isn't presented as some mystical intuition, but as complex, embodied information processing.
And the environments we inhabit actively sculpt our inner state, right? Our baseline level of vigilance, our fundamental sense of being held and safe, or conversely, exposed and anxious.
Absolutely. The survival loop, unfortunately, often taught us to distrust beauty or softness or openness in favor of control and defense. Safety felt like being in charge, like having walls up, not necessarily like being receptive or allowing the softening that beauty can inspire. We were often implicitly trained to override our own sensory truth in favor of obedience to the system's demands. Sit still under these awful lights. Hurry through this ugly space.
But cultivating post-survival consciousness involves learning to listen again, deeply, to those subtle body cues. The source gives examples we can all relate to. Sensing your stomach clench almost instantly under harsh fluorescent lighting, noticing your walking pace naturally soften when you step onto a textured stone path compared to slick, hard concrete, feeling your diaphragm subtly relax in a space that offers open sight lines versus one that feels cramped and enclosed.
Coherence isn't just an intellectual concept, it's cellular. And the body's innate capacity to feel it, to discern it, is presented as critical design data. Conscious towns, in theory, would use this felt sense as a baseline testing spaces, not just for their objective function, but by observing how actual human bodies respond within them, maybe even measuring subtle shifts in nervous system states. A space that naturally invites presence, ease, and connection works. A space that consistently induces rush, tension, or contraction needs refinement.
Every surface, every window frame, every hallway's width, every ambient sound, they're all sending subtle codes to the body about whether its dignity, its presence is truly allowed and welcomed here. Design, viewed this way, is profoundly political.
Because space teaches us how to behave. It tells us where to pause and where to rush, where to expand ourselves and where to shrink, and implicitly, who matters and who doesn't. A public bench designed without a back subtly signals an expectation of endurance, not restful lingering. A public building entrance with only stairs and no ramp sends a clear message of exclusion.
So conscious towns wouldn't start their design process with abstract policy manuals. They'd start with sensory justice.
Asking fundamental, embodied questions like, what does it actually feel like to belong in this space? Where does your breath naturally change? Where do your shoulders instinctively relax? The source argues forcefully that ignoring the sensorium, ignoring the body's wisdom, means you are consciously or unconsciously designing yet another form of cage, another environment that perpetuates stress and disconnection. Truly political, ethical architecture listens first to the body and designs to serve its deep needs for safety, beauty, rest, and connection. Success in this view is measured not just in efficiency or cost, but in the resulting ease within the collective nervous system, the quality of presence people naturally inhabit, and the depth of implicit trust that emerges in the space.
In a society that becomes sensory-aware, aesthetically intelligent, doesn't see beauty and justice as separate categories.
No. The shape of a door handle, the texture of a wall you might lean against, the way natural light enters a room, these aren't mere aesthetic frills. They can literally change a life by subtly influencing the body's felt sense of safety, dignity, and belonging. Softness isn't weakness. It's a fundamental right that needs to be consciously designed back into our abrasive world. The built world is always a mirror, reflecting our values and our collective state of being. The exciting proposition is that we are now capable of consciously building new, more coherent reflections.
And this connects directly to that evocative idea of the return of the ethical city.
Yeah, the reminder that cities, throughout much of history, were conceived and built as vessels of collective meaning. Think of ancient Athens debating democracy in the agora, or Renaissance Florence embodying humanism in its art and architecture. They aim to embody particular worldviews through their physical space, their public rhythms, their shared rituals. The ethical city, in this contemporary framework, isn't some impossible utopia. It's understood more functionally as a well-regulated civic nervous system. How we build is a direct, tangible expression of what we truly believe.
And ethics isn't just some abstract code written down somewhere. It's perceptual. It lives in the concrete details where the benches invite pause, how the street design encourages slowness and interaction, how open and truly accessible the public clauses are.
It lives in the practicalities, too. How waste is handled respectfully, whether food is grown locally and integrated into the city fabric, whether elders are visible, valued, and integrated, whether strangers feel genuinely sheltered and welcomed. An ethical city, in this vision, consciously optimizes its design for fostering relation and connection, not merely facilitating faster transactions. It deliberately makes physical and temporal space for the pause, the deep listening, the nuance that simply cannot survive in a constant state of noise, rush, and competition.
And beauty is seen as fundamentally infrastructural, not merely ornamental. It's not just something nice to look at. It actively signals respect. It helps restore the nervous system. It dignifies the simple act of being present in that space.
And the idea is that systemic beauty creates a kind of contagious dignity. When the environment itself signals that presence and care are valued, people naturally tend to stand a little taller, speak more carefully, listen with their whole faces. It's not about achieving perfection, but coherence. When the physical form genuinely matches the stated intention of the space, the body implicitly trusts it. And trust, the source argues repeatedly, is perhaps the rarest and most valuable currency in our fragmented modern world.
We lost this vision of the ethical city incrementally, didn't we? Prioritizing short-term profit over long-term presence, prioritizing sheer scale over human intimacy, prioritizing extraction over reciprocity.
Conscious towns are presented as an attempt to consciously revive these ancient principles of civic coherence and ethical embodiment, using present-day logic, understanding of neuroscience, and potentially post-scarcity tools and technologies. They aim to honor the emotional infrastructure of life, treating the needs of the nervous system and human vulnerability as crucial design inputs, not as inconvenient inefficiencies to be optimized away.
They're envisioned as being alive with ethical responsiveness, where technology is governed by human touch and wisdom, and where economics genuinely serves the atmosphere of life itself, not just abstract growth metrics on a spreadsheet.
The ethical city, viewed this way, isn't some distant, impossible dream. It's a discipline, a constant, ongoing practice of choosing, designing, building, and tending together.
It's really clear the source is arguing for a fundamental redesign across the board, not just, tinkering around the edges of the existing system. And this obviously extends beyond just architecture and rituals to the very basis of how we organize our collective effort and resources our economy.
Absolutely. The traditional economy, as we've kind of established, is built on what the source calls trauma-era logic. More is always better, faster is always smarter, cheaper is always the measure of success. It's a fear-coded design, rooted in that survival loop. Fundamentally, it operates as an extraction chain, pulling resources from the earth, extracting labor from people, extracting value from time, and then repackaging it for consumption, with little or no inherent space designed for genuine regeneration or restoration at any level.
And the source mentions these hypothetical or maybe conceptual systems like AAN and CSES. As a contrast to this, what are they about?
Yeah, these are presented as potential elements of a fundamentally different post-violent economic model. AAN is described as an attunement and allocation network, a system designed to listen and route resources based on real-time sensing of the network's needs and capacities, not relying solely on rigid, often lagging price signals. CSES stands for Conscious Scientific Economic System, and it's described more as a design language for coherence. It's about defining what is truly worth listening to and valuing beyond simple monetary price.
So it's like an attempt to teach our economic systems, whether they're run by humans, algorithms, or a mix, how to perceive value and meaning in ways that go beyond just profit, like factoring in well-being or ecological health.
Exactly. CSES, as conceptualized, acts as a kind of economic early warning system where systemic stress, whether it's ecological damage or human burnout, is recognized as a fundamental cost to the system. And things like joy, creativity, or social cohesion are seen as vital indicators of alignment and overall systemic health. It aims to reverse centuries of abstraction, constantly asking, how do we design economic systems that actively generate coherence across all scales, from the individual's nervous system right up to the planetary ecosystem? The economy is viewed not as a machine for profit, but as a shared metabolism, and CSES is conceived as a way to ensure the metabolism is fed with dignity, sustainability, and genuinely life-affirming value.
And concepts we touched on earlier, like trust as infrastructure and shifting from growth to regenerative feedback, are deeply embedded in this economic rethinking.
Right. The argument isn't that growth itself is inherently bad, but that our definition of growth became pathologically fixated solely on accumulation. Blind growth, like the growth of a cancer cell, is purely extractive and ultimately self-destructive. Regenerative growth, in contrast, isn't about endless quantitative expansion. It's about qualitatively nourishing and enhancing the health, resilience, and coherence of the entire system.
And this is where aesthetic intelligence loops back in again, not as a luxury, but as actual functional infrastructure within this new economic logic.
Absolutely. Beauty in this context isn't just something nice to admire passively. It's actively engineered for coherence, because coherent, beautiful environments support well-being and functionality. A sunlit corridor in a workplace, a curved park bench that invites rest, the tactile feel of natural wood on a handrail, these aren't just decorative afterthoughts. They are subtle invitations, they provide neurological support, they act as attentional stabilizers, they're environmental codes telling the body implicitly that this system values its presence and dignity.
Ugly, discordant systems create friction, fatigue, and disconnection, which the source argues ultimately leads to various forms of violence, whether physical or emotional. Whereas beautiful systems designed with aesthetic intelligence.
They naturally encourage people to relax, to synchronize their internal rhythms, to care more for the space and for each other, to linger, to stay present. Beauty, the source suggests, is the body's innate recognition of harmonious pattern, the right proportions, a pleasing rhythm, the quality of light, the texture of materials. These are fundamental biological signals of safety and rightness.
So beauty literally becomes infrastructure, embedded in the core logic and valuation system, not just sprinkled on top afterwards if there's budget left over.
Yes. Think about the increasing evidence showing that hospitals designed with access to natural light and better acoustics actually result in faster patient healing. This isn't just poetic optimism. It's a verifiable design principle. Beauty is fundamentally ethical. It is felt ethics that you can literally sit inside and walk through. Conceptual systems like CSES and AAN would aim to embed this aesthetic intelligence into their core design parameters, recognizing it as essential for long-term viability, not mere vanity. A system isn't truly regenerative if its interfaces induce chronic stress in its users. It isn't truly humane if it assaults the senses. It can't genuinely claim to uphold dignity if it subtly strips the soul.
So the blocks in a conscious town aren't just designed for function. They're designed to be felt, to restore rhythm, to offer visual coherence, to invite spaciousness and physical balance in the inhabitants.
Beauty, in this comprehensive context, becomes the core infrastructure of trust, safety, and long-term continuity. It's how the system signals its deeper values directly to our nervous systems, bypassing intellectual argument.
And absolutely central to all of this, woven through the discussions of ritual, architecture, and economics, is a call for a radical shift in our relationship with something we experience every single second time, moving towards conscious time and the end of hustle logic.
Yeah, the source delves really deeply into what it refers to as the colonization of time. Time, it argues, was originally experienced as seasonal, cyclical, relational, deeply tied to the rhythms of the tides, the fertility of the soil, animal migrations, the arc of the sun and moon. It belonged organically to these natural cycles and answered to local ceremonies and songs. It was lived, embodied, felt.
But the colonial project wasn't just about conquering physical land, it was also about conquering and standardizing time.
Exactly. The source argues they were twins. Think of the imposition of the missionary bell imposing a rigid foreign schedule on indigenous communities, ignoring their traditional timekeeping. Think of the plantation whistle dictating labor purely by the clock, severing workers from natural light cycles. Think of the factory siren demanding uniform arrival and departure, enforcing obedience to industrial time above all else. This process systematically erased diverse local rhythms, silenced ancestral pacing, and imposed a single, linear, abstract, and, crucially for the colonizers, profitable concept of time onto everyone. Rest, slowness, non-productivity were actively recoded as laziness or inefficiency. Speed and obedience to the clock became paramount virtues. It wasn't just a change in how we scheduled things, it was a fundamental ontological shift, a deep change in the very nature of how we perceive and relate to time itself.
And this colonized, linear, fragmented experience of time, it directly fractures our attention spans and makes genuine, deep presence incredibly scarce.
Absolutely. When time itself is monetized down to the second, presence becomes a luxury good few can afford. We become so deeply embedded in this linear, profitable model that we literally forget there are other ways of experiencing time, other valid rhythms. We learn to distrust slowness. We apologize for moments of stillness or contemplation, and we chronically mistake sheer exhaustion for meaningful contribution or success. The source argues this isn't just a personal preference or lifestyle issue. It's a profound nervous system crisis. Time severed from its natural and biological rhythms means the body loses its fundamental sense of safety. We stay perpetually stuck in low-grade alert mode, constantly overriding our innate needs for rest and cyclical recovery, organizing our entire days around artificial, often false, urgency, and we pat ourselves on the back calling it success or ambition. Hustle, in this light, is the cultural performance that hides the profound depth of that severance.
So decolonizing time isn't just about, say, fighting for a 4-day work week, though that might be part of it. It's about the much deeper work of remembering and actively reclaiming rhythm, starting to consciously sync again with our own breath, with the pace of our communities, with the cycles of the biosphere. It requires seeing clearly what was stolen from us in the first place.
Time doesn't have to be experienced as this violent, relentless, linear imposition. It can be shaped, felt, breathed into, almost like breath itself. Ritual, as we discussed, becomes a key tool here to actively re-sculpt time, to shape our experience of it, to match the actual needs of human nervous systems and ecological realities, not just the insatiable demands of quarterly profit margins. A simple morning ritual isn't just another task to check off. It sets the energetic tone for the day, reminding your nervous system that you're not late for your own life. A weekly period of shared communal silence recalibrates the collective temporal field. Seasonal rituals reconnect us consciously to our place and its unique cyclical unfolding.
These become crucial temporal anchors, liberating time from feeling like a relentless conveyor belt speeding towards nowhere in particular. It starts to feel more like an ecological fabric that we actually belong to, that holds us, that has different textures and tempos.
And in the proposed framework of conscious towns, ritual becomes a fundamental spatial and temporal design tool. Designers aren't just asking what activities happen in a public square, but also when they happen, how often, and at what tempo. A plaza isn't considered fully designed until the felt sense of its potential rituals, the natural rhythms of gathering, solitary passage, playful interaction, and quiet rest, is deeply understood and actively supported by the physical form. A connecting corridor isn't truly coherent until the inherent rhythm of collective return and passage through it is known, felt, and honored in the design. This points towards developing a kind of post-capitalist timekeeping, one consciously attuned to human thresholds, somatic intelligence, and civic attunement.
So when ritual becomes the living architecture of time, the city itself starts to function like a kind of clock that actually heals, that carries us collectively, that moves more like music than a machine, and that subtly restores the fundamental, often lost feeling of enoughness in each passing moment.
Moving finally from these profound shifts in our relationship with time, the source brings us to the integration of urgency and presence, suggesting a move from urgency to ceremony.
Urgency itself isn't inherently bad, right? It's a necessary biological signal in moments of genuine danger.
Absolutely. But the source argues that when urgency becomes the default setting for everyday life, it fundamentally deforms us. We rush frantically through our days, treat every minor decision as a 5-alarm fire drill, speak and even think in speeds that consistently outrun our capacity for nuance, reflection, and genuine connection. And the systems we build inevitably reflect this internal panic look at hyper-reactive 2047 news cycles, the move fast and break things ethos of many startups, the often short-sighted nature of reactive policymaking.
And people end up living in a state of almost permanent reaction, constantly putting out fires.
Which means we lose the capacity for deep peace, but also for clear discernment. Ceremony, in this context, is presented as a deliberate, conscious interruption of that default urgency. It introduces an intentional, often slower rhythm. It marks time with shared meaning, not just efficiency. It teaches the body, through repetition, to slow down enough to actually notice the thresholds, the subtle moments of transition between one state, one activity, one season, one phase of life and another.
So in the vision of conscious town, ceremony isn't just reserved for special holidays. It becomes almost infrastructural, part of the operating system.
Yes, exactly. Opening a new community building might intentionally begin with a slow, silent listening walk through the space, allowing people to arrive fully before any speeches begin. Marking seasonal transitions might involve regular communal gatherings focused on shared breathwork, cooking together, or storytelling. Introducing significant policy changes might involve a specific ceremony designed to acknowledge the potential human impact and allow for collective processing and feedback rather than just issuing an impersonal announcement.
It's about consciously synchronizing necessary change with collective coherence.
It allows us, individually and collectively, to actually metabolize what is happening, rather than just constantly bracing for the next shock or demand. A culture dominated by urgency tends to harden people, making them brittle and reactive. Ceremony, by consciously holding transitions and creating intentional space for processing, softens. And softness in this framework isn't weakness. It's the fertile ground required for sustainable complexity, for resilience, for genuine connection to emerge. The future we desire, the source argues, isn't going to be built in a state of perpetual panic. It can only be shaped within the tempo of presence. Conscious time ultimately is about designing societies where true urgency is recognized as a rare and important signal, and ceremony, in myriad forms, becomes a routine grounding practice. Wow, okay. We have covered so much ground pulling from these really rich, dense sources, starting with that really arresting idea of the Anthrocytic disease as a symptom, right? A symptom of our ancient survival programming still running the show in what the source calls a violent universe. And then exploring the deep roots of that pattern in our evolutionary history, our biology, our collective relationship with unhealed trauma, and how fear itself became embedded in the very architecture of our culture and institutions.
Before moving into that challenging but potentially powerful framework of Ontosinclecticism, presented not as a fixed answer, but as a way of thinking and sensing, specifically designed for navigating chaos and maybe becoming post-survival beings.
And finally, delving into these concrete architectures for potential healing and redesign, both internal, through to addressing burnout, cultivating surplus consciousness, and moving towards a post-survival identity, and external, through the deliberate use of onto-rituals, the vision of conscious towns, new economic principles grounded in coherence, and a fundamentally different relationship with conscious time.
It really does all seem to circle back to that core, challenging, but ultimately, I think, quite hopeful thesis threaded throughout the source material, that consciousness doesn't evolve by somehow escaping the fire, the difficulty, the intensity of reality. It actually evolves by learning how to transmute it, how to skillfully metabolize that energy into something new.
Yeah, the violent, turbulent universe isn't presented as some external enemy we need to defeat or escape from. It's framed more as the fundamental raw material of our existence, the substrate we have to work with.
Yeah.
And the next epoch of consciousness, the potential shift towards a more coherent, ethical, and sustainable way of being, doesn't come from wishing away the chaos or complexity. It comes from developing craftsmanship.
Crafting new internal states through awareness and practice. Crafting new ways of relating to ourselves and each other through intentional ritual. Crafting new physical environments in things like conscious towns. Crafting new economic principles based on life. And crafting a conscious, rhythmic relationship with time itself. It feels like a direct call to engage skillfully with the inherent fire of our reality, not to run screaming from it.
And the source speaks quite directly at times to you, the listener, especially if you've ever had that feeling, that sense of not quite fitting into the relentless pace and logic of the modern world, like you're maybe never fully adapted to the way things seem to operate. It reframes that feeling not as being broken or deficient, but perhaps as being, well, a prototype.
A prototype. For a different kind of nervous system, maybe. A different kind of consciousness. One that maybe remembers something older, something deeper, perhaps something truer than the current simulation we find ourselves running. It frames this whole journey not as just collapsing the old system out of despair, but as an active, conscious choice to redirect the flame within ourselves, to begin consciously replacing the simulation with something more aligned.
Because the simulation, as the source puts it, doesn't just magically die because you wake up and realize its nature. It dies, slowly, perhaps, when you actively, consistently replace it with something else, moment by moment, choice by choice.
Which leaves us with a really powerful final thought to maybe carry forward, something drawn directly from the source's concluding ideas. After grappling with all these complex frameworks, diagnoses, and propositions, perhaps the most important reading you can do now
is your own nervous system, recalibrated, writing the future.
That really brings everything we've explored. The body's ancient intelligence, the deep need for healing and integration, the transformative power of intentional design, the tangible possibility of building a radically different future right back to you personally, right here, in this moment. It feels like an invitation, doesn't it? An invitation to become a coherence architect in your own life and, by inevitable extension, in the world unfolding around you.
It has definitely been a truly deep dive into some challenging, intense, but potentially transformative ideas presented in this source material. We really appreciate you joining us on this exploration, wrestling with the Anthrocytic disease, the violent universe, Ontosinclecticism, and the possibilities that might just emerge when we dare to face the fire with a commitment to conscious craftsmanship.
Yeah, we really hope these insights offer you maybe a new set of lenses, some different angles to view the world, perhaps your own experiences of stress or disconnection, and the complex systems we're all trying to navigate. Maybe you'll start to notice that survival loop playing out a bit more clearly, or hear the quiet call of rhythm underneath all the noise, and begin to see the potential for cultivating coherence, even in small ways, everywhere you look.
Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us.
Until next time.